Thank you so much for coming. I'm John Diller, one of Karl's sons. I'll just do a little welcome and then we'll move into the program. It's great to have all of you here in person in this lovely place. A together event. This might be the biggest event I've been to in 3 years. Quite a number of people wanted to join us online as well, but it turns out the Wi-Fi isn't good enough. So we are recording, so we'll post that for them. But they're with us here as well. Quite a number of relatives and friends, and so just to bring them in, their presence here. And there will be other people who will watch the recording or hear stories from you all, and they'll be here too in that way. And so I want to acknowledge people who couldn't make it because of distance, or because it's almost impossible to travel these days, or because they've gone before. I've thought a lot about ancestry and people who've died and who've led up and to who we are, who I am, who my dad was. I always love the phrase, standing on the shoulders of giants. But these days I feel like we're standing on the shoulders of anyone that's pretty awesome. Or maybe even just riding in the Jerry pack. It's a special thing to gather in celebration of a life. To gather to honor and remember someone we love. To come together to hold each other's grief at losing Karl, losing my dad. We're here because Karl made a difference in our lives and the lives of those close to us. It's an amazing thing that one person can make such a difference for each of us. It's easy to lose track of how much any one person in our lives matters to us. It's easy to lose track of how much each of our lives matters as well. They matter. Mattering goes both ways. Each of you mattered to my dad. Some of you mattered a great deal. You shaped him and contributed to his well-lived and full life. Karl died content and confident at having lived a good life, full of love, purpose, curiosity, service, and so much more. Nonetheless, we feel the loss. There's a hole. The world is a different shape without him alive in it. We each had our own relationship with him, our own special times of connections, some more recent, some more past. We each have our own particular grief. I believe sharing is a way to knit the world back together again. To bring Karl into clear view, to celebrate, to remember and grieve him, and also to strengthen the web of relationships that help us carry on. Thank you for coming. To help bring those people who are distant in, we have some readings and mentions of people specific. There are so many, but there are a couple very directed ones. So Melissa will start. My wife Melissa will start with one of those.
So, as you know, I'm Melissa, John's wife, and I am Karl's daughter-in-law. I'm here right now to speak for Stacy Cutter, who would have been here today if she weren't in Paris. And I think we can take comfort from the fact that Karl would have celebrated her being there in body and here in spirit. Stacy is Carl's niece through Liz, daughter of Dave and Marianne Holsinger, Liz's brother and sister-in-law, and sister of Angie. Stacy had a special relationship with Karl and Liz, and she's given me some words to say about that, as well as a poem to read in Karl's honor. But before I do that, I'd like to share a story about Stacy's visit to California in March. So, a little scene setting. Karl's health first took a turn last November when he had his heart incident. And he had just come back from Greece. He was in the hospital. John nursed him through a long hospital stay and a slow recovery. And in the new year, he seemed to be improving. We thought we were on that trajectory toward full function again, really. But in January, his kidney function started to decline. In February, his numbers started to get really worrying. And in March, John had to take him to the ER for emergency dialysis. So Karl had 2 more hospital stays in March, and both were fairly long, and John moved into the hospital to be with him. He oversaw every detail of Karl's care while trying to work at his job. John had to cancel a solo backpacking trip he'd planned for his birthday. And I was working long hours at my job. I was trying to help, cook and go to the hospital to relieve John when I could. But by the end of March, we were tired. And we were supposed to go on a vacation in Mendocino. And we thought, this will be really helpful because when we come back, we're facing a new future. Karl is entering dialysis. This is going to be a new time of life. We need to figure out how to support him, how to get through it ourselves, what we need to put in place, right? So it would be really great to have a vacation, but we couldn't leave Karl. He needed care. And so we thought, all right, we'll cancel the trip. What are we going to do? It's tough, but it's a no-brainer. And John said, Stacy offered to come if we ever needed her. She said, just call, and she would come. And I was like, really? Because she lives in Dallas, And he emailed her, and she came on very little notice. And she stayed with Karl for 5 days. She managed his care, and it was intense. He had just gotten into dialysis. He needed a lot of help. He was on a brutal dialysis schedule every day. Some days they had to get up at 4 a.m., take him in by 5. And he was having trouble at night with digestion. They were up every night. This was intense. And she went to every appointment. She fed him every meal. Single-handedly, she did this without complaint. In fact, John and I were in Mendocino, and we did not hear from them at all. We got maybe one text that said, hope you guys are having a great vacation, and we were. We got to rest. And in the car on the way back to Oakland, we got a text from Karl. And it said he had done a lot of thinking and he was ready to end his life. And this was not something we had expected. We knew that he would be intentional about end of life, but we had had this kind of, concatenation of events and healthcare that he was receiving. Okay, now I'm doing this, now I'm getting this procedure, and we thought that's the direction we were heading in. So when we got that text, it was a surprise and it was painful. But we had some energy and resources to handle it because we had just had a vacation thanks to Stacy. And, we had to make a quick pivot. It was like, okay, now we're going toward end-of-life process, and now we want to do everything that involves, and we want to get people here, and we want to have a celebration. And Karl immediately went back into the hospital the minute we got back, and we had resources because of Stacy. One more thing, and I'll get to Stacy's part. You heard me say that, Karl told us he was ready to end his life in a text when we were in the car on the way home. And we did find that kind of surprising timing. We thought maybe he could have waited until we got it, what? But okay, And then when we got home and we talked to Stacy, we found out he had told her rather that he was ready to end his life right after we left for Mendocino. He was clear, he was ready, he wanted to start getting everything in place, and he wanted to tell us. He said, well, I'd like to text them, and she said, give them this week. Just see if you can hold it and tell them when they're in the car on the way home so they can talk about it before they get here. And that was a tremendous gift to us. It's just, thank you, Stacy. And thank you, Karl, also, because he held that. So this is Stacy now talking. My journey with Karl and Liz. When I was 15, Liz married Karl Diller. My sister and I spent a week in Lee that summer with them at the beautiful home they had built. I remember helping hammer boards on part of the porch or maybe the mudroom. I was always close to my Aunt Liz and therefore got to know Karl too. When Chris and I got married in 1997, Liz and Karl traveled to Missouri to visit my grandma and come to the wedding. And as our family grew, we made a point to always visit them in New Hampshire in the summer and then to Vermont when they moved there. And I remember saying to Karl, I couldn't believe I'd never been to Vermont. And he said, well, it really isn't on the way to anywhere unless you're going to Montreal. So you have to really want to come here. And she said, yeah, he was right. After Chris passed away in 2007, the girls and I continued to see him and Liz during the summers in Vermont. And in 2009, I was ready for a change. I emailed Karl and Liz in Hawaii and asked them if I could rent their house in Bristol while they were away. And that's how I came to live in Vermont. In August 2010, we moved to Weybridge, about 10 miles from Bristol, and lived there until June of 2018. I loved being close to Karl and Liz. We had so many happy times with Adam and his family, as well as Dave Diller and Matt and Melissa and their kids. After Liz died, Karl started to travel again and was formulating what his plan would be for the coming years. And after he had moved to Greece, I decided it was time for the girls and I to visit him, and we did in April 2018. And what a magical week we had, touring Athens, spending a day in Hydra, one in Aegina. We hiked the hill near the university, apparently a very tall hill, and saw all the sights, and Karl met us each morning for breakfast at our hotel, and we enjoyed evening meals with him too. After we moved to Dallas in 2018, we kept in touch by phone and email, and we spent time with him in Bristol in July of 2020 as he was packing his house, getting ready to move to California. And I used my experience from working at an art gallery to help him pack up his antique family pictures and other items for his move. I'll switch to talk, now it's Melissa. Karl didn't bring a lot with him to California. He liked one of those, sort of small shipping containers, and so much of it was art. So much of it. And the walls were just covered, and you could feel the presence, of Liz and of his life, and it was very real. Okay, now I'm Stacy again. In March of 2021, Cammie and I were able to see Karl in California when we were touring at UC Berkeley. He spent the day with us touring campus, and we took the metro into San Francisco, and we walked about 10 miles. And our day ended with a picnic at Karl's apartment with Ethiopian food. It was perfect. My time with him this past March was precious and special. We had some great talks and laughed and cried together. I miss him. This is the poem Stacy sent. It's called Ithaca. It's written by the beloved Greek poet Constantine Cavaphi in 1911. Stacy says, this poem is based on Homer's Odyssey, and I thought Karl would like its being read at his service. I'm sure he had read it at some point. I like the idea that the journey is the point of life, not arriving at your destination. And it's all the adventure along the way that makes a life well lived. Karl certainly did that in spades. As you set out for Ithaca, hope your road is a long one, full of adventure, full of discovery. Lystrygonians, Cyclops, angry Poseidon, don't be afraid of them. You'll never find things like that on your way as long as you keep your thoughts raised high. As long as a rare excitement stirs your spirit and your body. Lystrygonians, Cyclops, wild Poseidon, you won't encounter them unless you bring them along inside your soul, unless your soul sets them up in front of you. Hope your road is a long one. May there be many summer mornings when, with what pleasure, what joy, you enter harbors you're seeing for the first time. May you stop at Phoenician trading stations to buy fine things, mother of pearl and coral, amber and ebony, sensual perfume of every kind, as many sensual perfumes as you can. And may you visit Egyptian cities to learn and go on learning from their scholars. Keep Ithaca always in your mind. Arriving there is what you're destined for. But don't hurry the journey at all. Better if it lasts for years. So you're old by the time you reach the island, wealthy with all you've gained along the way, not expecting Ithaca to make you rich. Ithaca gave you the marvelous journey. Without her, you wouldn't have set out. She has nothing left to give you now. And if you find her poor, Ithaca won't have fooled you. Wise as you will have become, so full of experience, you'll have understood by then what these Ithacas mean.
The next we'll have some music and remarks by Dave Diller, my brother.
So I'll have a chance to speak later, but I'm going to play a Bach G that my dad would always ask me to play every time I came and visited. I learned it as a child in the Suzuki method, which he supported quite strongly.
Adam Ginsberg, stepbrother, stepson, brother, son.
So I wanted to show you guys these because somehow I inherited these from Karl. These were Karl's, and those of you who got to spend a little time with him, you probably got to see him laugh. You may not have heard him laugh because Karl laughed very silently. If we always loved to make him laugh because he'd go like this, and then we loved it, and then that would make us laugh. And anyway, that's a little bit of an aside. So I'm one of Karl's stepsons. What a most beautiful man. My brother Matthews and my folks divorced when we were 13, and not long after, my mother got engaged to a man that we didn't know very well. Karl proposed to our mother by asking her, "Will you build a house with me?" Which I've always thought was really a beautiful, beautiful way to propose. It had been a dream of his for many years. And with one master builder, a bunch of salvaged windows and other salvaged parts, and the trees from the land, over the next 2 years, they built a big, beautiful, rambling, rough pine house with some very unskilled labor from their 4 boys, and they built Karl's dream. And as the house came together, the new family did as well. I think that experience, I really hadn't thought about it too much previously, but I think that experience really brought us all together. In a really amazing way, and as the house grew, so too did my love for Karl. And you know, he was quiet and kind and thoughtful and generous, loving and supportive of my mother. Many years later, I became an architect, and I have wondered since kind of how much that experience kind of influenced me in my professional life. But in those few years that before 4 boys had together, we became brothers in that house. It was a house filled with art and music and laughter. And Mom and Karl then took us on many trips. One epic trip where they bought an old used van, a massive old kind of piece of junk that we kept going mostly across the country and back, and my mom almost left a couple times during that trip to fly home. Almost couldn't take it. 4 boys, 4 high school boys in a van, but we made it and had many kind of wonderful trips like that to Bali and Hong Kong, Japan. They took us all over the place, and really beautiful kind of trips. And many years went by, and 16 years ago, my mother and Karl sold that big rambling place that we built in New Hampshire, and they moved up to Vermont to live with my wife Kristen and our 2 girls. We bought a house together, and they lived on one side, and we lived on the other side. And it was a pretty extraordinary experience. And harking back to our childhood, Karl and my mom and Kristen and I, we designed and then implemented a bunch of revisions to the house. We got to design and build together again, which is pretty extraordinary. And Karl, I mean, he was a linguistics professor and so forth, an academic, but he was also an architect and a really skilled builder. That maybe many people may not know, but wonderful, just such a pleasure to work with him. And then our girls profited greatly from this experience of living side by side with my mom and with Karl. And Karl taught them how to bake extraordinary pies. If anybody needs a pie, those 2 gals right there will take care of that for you, because Karl taught them how. And he taught them how to play Clue and Monopoly and chess. It really made it much easier on Kristen and myself that we didn't have to do those things with the kids if we didn't want to. We just send them over the other side. Karl and my mom would take care of that, and Karl helped even practice her piano as she grew up. They adored their Papa Karl, and it was pretty special to have that time with him there. Some years passed, and Ma got sick, and Karl nursed her until she passed. For years, 5-6 years, it was often a full-time job. He sacrificed willingly his own needs and desires in the process, never once complaining or expressing even any frustration through what was really a very challenging situation at times. And all those who love my mother will be forever grateful for her care of her in those years. Just so generous and kind and patient and thoughtful. After Ma passed, Karl lived another dream and went to Greece, where he studied and taught. Karl was a man who was interested in so many things. He was a linguistics professor who then, upon retirement, went back to school and got a PhD in genetics. And then wrote some papers, did some stuff, and then went to Greece and studied Greek language and history for 2 or 3 years. And I wanted to say that I think one of the kind of things that genius about Karl is that because of his interest in so many different disciplines and the depth of his knowledge in these disciplines, he could very easily take one idea from one discipline and apply it to another, which other people who didn't know about architecture and linguistics could never do, or linguistics and genetics, or whatever it was. I always thought that was pretty extraordinary, and one of the things that really made him academically so extraordinary. I like to say, before I conclude, I just want to say too that kind of something I've always really appreciated, that it, as a testament to Karl's beautiful heart and that of my other 3 parents, when my father and my lovely stepmother Carolyn had gifted my brother and me a little baby sister, Sonia, who's here today and now much older than she was back then, they asked my mother and Karl to be the godparents of their baby daughter. And I think it's, Karl's heart, and it was part of kind of enabling my now 4 parents to have had such a really beautiful and special relationship. And that then kind of trickled on down to all the grandkids and everybody else, and really quite a gift. And it was in large part kind of Karl and Carolyn's beautiful souls. A beautiful, generous soul. I'll be forever grateful for his influence on my life, and I will keep his spirit with me forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Matt Ginsberg, other brother, son, stepbrother, stepson.
I think John just coined the term stepbrother from another mother, but I guess that's implicit anyway. So I'm Matthew Ginsberg. I'm the Karl's younger stepson and Liz's younger son. And I will try to be brief in my remarks, and John has pointed out to me that that's a challenge for me at times, but it's occupational in part. I think, when John and Melissa let us know that Karl was not doing well in April, and that he had decided to end his own life, we decided very quickly that and they invited us to come out to California and spend the better part of the weekend, or 3 days out there with them and with Karl, and that was mid-April earlier this year. And so preparing to go out there and see Karl, and knowing that they plan to do a celebration of life, I started looking through some photos and some old files and things that I had from family in the old days, which Adam described. And as I did, I came across a copy of a letter that Karl had written on my behalf to the Oyster River High School administration. And as I was reading through this, I'd completely forgotten about it, but as I was reading through this letter, I was reminded both about the subject matter and about a very essential piece of Karl's character that is maybe won't get the same airplay today as some of his other characteristics and qualities. As Adam pointed out, and you'll hear from others, Karl was an incredible, had incredible intellectual curiosity. He had a thirst for knowledge. He was, introspective. He was kind. He was thoughtful. He was supportive. He was endlessly patient. But what I was reminded reading his letter is that he was both very courageous in an intellectual sense, but in a general sense as well. And he was, the best way I can say it is, if you were in with Karl, he had your back to the end. And this letter was written about a sort of upper level math teacher, just about the only one in our high school, unfortunately. And I hope he's not listening anywhere where no one here is related to him. But I'll keep from slinging too much mud. But this professor's name is Stojkovic, and he was tough. Oh my God. He was a bit of a character of fun because of his clothing and his mannerisms, but he was just, you might call him a hater. You know, he was just one of those people that seemed to want you to fail. Or maybe that was my excuse, I don't know, because I was just about failing with him. But, you know, he was the kind of teacher who'll take 2 points off because you showed your work, you wrote it all down, you got the right answer, but your work was kind of slanted, you know, on the page. And it was dispiriting and you know, it was tough. And so I probably came home and complained, bitched about Stojkovic, and I, you know, Karl and I talked about it, and I think without telling me or without my knowing, he wrote this letter to the administration, and it was partly an expression of his belief in how you teach and, you know, how people learn. And it was partly just it was partly just support. You know, it was just an incredible expression by him of support for his, you know, stepson, but that's the kind of guy he was. You know, we can laud him for his kindness and his generosity and his everything he did in his life, which was wonderful enough. But he was an incredibly strong and supportive and generous backer, if you will. So that's one thing I wanted to say about Karl. I think the other thing I want to say is, Adam stole my thunder a little bit, but I was reminded of this because the four of us, the stepbrothers, were on a chat and we were texting about something, you know, some stuff leading up to today, and I had the opportunity to make a really inane sophomoric comment of some kind about a piece of clothing, and I just went for it, you know, and as like what that reminded me was I immediately thought of Karl, because he is serious. You know, anyone who knows him and knew Karl knows that he was very serious. I mean, a lot of the time, and he had a lot of things on his mind, which are a hell of a lot more important than, you know, teenage humor and a lot of the stuff that, you know, watching old home movies this week, I realized that we did when we were teenagers. I don't know how he put up with us, but the thing about Karl that was really fun was that I felt it was my job at times to make that really sophomoric, inane comment to him, because as Adam pointed out, I could get him to kind of go, and I knew I tickled him. You know, I knew he needed that. I knew he needed to have someone bring him down from his lofty, you know, sort of intellectual perch, and so I did it again and again, probably far too much, but I think we all love that about Karl. You could always get a smirk or a smile out of him, and he just had a very light heart, despite the fact that he was very often kind of thinking through important things. But needless to say, you know, our journey with Karl started out, you know, a little rocky in that we suddenly had a stepfather, and, you know, we already had a father and didn't feel we needed another father, but his kind spirit sort of brought us along, and we all formed another family, and without leaving our other one behind, and I'll never forget that about Karl. He had that ability to sort of bring you into a calm, sweet space, and I'll always miss that, and among his other qualities. Thank you.
Thank you. You might start to see that the names of relationships don't really do justice to the relationships, and they get a little complicated, and that will continue to progress. And it is, of course, the relationships that matter way more than whatever names we come up for them. The easiest way to introduce Bill Ginsberg is to say that he's the father of Adam and Matt. But that's, of course, cheating somewhat, because what exactly does that make his relationship to my dad? I'll say that probably one of the most wondrous things, especially this last 10, 20 years, maybe especially the 10, but years, is that for my dad, he was a close friend and someone that he really loved talking to. So for all the breadth of their relationship going back since before Sonia was born, that friendship toward the end of his life is definitely a big part of what was special about his relationship to Phil. So here's Phil.
When I was younger, which is a long time, there was a catchphrase in which a speaker started out trying to be lighthearted or modest or something by saying, "Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking," and then go on, of course, so that anything that came after that would be a great achievement on her part. Well, I have to confess that I'm accustomed to public speaking, or used to be. And I don't think that I ever wrote a speech, ever. I had an idea, and I got up, and I improvised. And almost always got a couple of laughs, and never was beaten behind the meeting hall for my efforts. Karl requires more than that. For me, required more than that. So I sat down and I began by reading John's beautiful and very expressive and loving, but true obituary of his father. And if you haven't read it yet, make a point of finding that and reading it. If you read it, you may respond, or probably would respond, if, like me, you wanted to say something about Karl. Because it's impossible to summarize the man, except in one way, and I'll get to that. It's extraordinary as you go through it. And I have to confess that, or claim really, that both my sons and John, but especially the boys, have co-opted a good part of my vocabulary for talking about Karl. And don't be disappointed by that, because what I have to say will summarize him in a way that I don't think anyone else I've ever known or even heard of could be summarized. So that's by way of trying to excuse my failings. And I'll save that, so you'll be surprised and I hope pleased when I get to it. And as has been said, I could start every sentence almost with this, as has already been said about Karl. He was shy, quiet, inward, right? And he laughed as if he were paralyzed. And if you had a conversation, got into a conversation with him, when you said something, for a second or two, it seemed as if he hadn't heard you. Maybe it's me, but I think that was his habit. And it was a little unsettling when I first knew him, and I got used to it after a time. But I went and read John's obituary, and I went through it, and I decided that there was, I wasn't going to be able to wing it, because there's just too much. And I came to the conclusion that this probably was due to the fact that Karl was always A, thinking, and B, open to what he was hearing. And he took, and it wasn't long, I mean, for somebody with his brain, couldn't take more than a nanosecond or two, what his real thoughts and reactions were to what you had just said to him. And so a conversation was just nanosecond halting here and there, but it was actually a conversation. You know how unusual that is in life? Think about it. Most conversations go easily from one thing to the next, and we don't need to think about what we're going to say next because it doesn't require much thought. It's almost reflexive. With Karl, nothing was reflexive. Everything bore some thought, some consideration. And it always reflected who he was, which is a man of enormous breadth of intellect and commitment to learning. And that, I think, is a good part of what you'd say about him, what I would say about him. But not, and it would be enough. Because immediately when you say that, learning, thinking, you think of a classic academic type who is not terribly fascinated by much else and lives his life quietly. There it is. That's Karl. No. This is a man with untold and unseen depths. And really, this had never occurred to me, quite in the way it did when I read the obituary, 3 pages of John's enumerating Karl's activities and behavior and habits of thought and emotion and feeling throughout his life. Because Karl, unlike many of us at many times, make a show of all those things, our feelings, our observations, our wit, whether we have any or not. And Karl, low-key, underestimates his manner, his braggadocio, the degree of braggadocio that he had. It wasn't any. It was all thoughtful, all considered, all careful, but all done quickly enough that you could have a very good, very interesting conversation with him always. And it was that, as John mentioned, that I just so cherished in the last 15 years of his life. The first 15, I won't say they were difficult, but, you know, the circumstances, they weren't fully evolved. We had just both been divorced, and 3 of us in that foursome had been divorced. Actually, all 4 of us, but 3 among themselves, kept it private, you know. And so there were certain logistics to work out, let's say. I'll tell you, it was never difficult. Partly because Liz and I think, both felt guilty about our marriage. And it made it comfortable. And partly because Carolyn, and another thing I'm stealing from my son, one of my sons, Adam, I think, both Carolyn and Karl, both Carolyn and who's the other person?
Liz?
Both Carolyn and Liz were, well, they were, no, it's not Liz actually. Carolyn was extraordinary and Karl was extraordinary in accepting, adapting, gathering with us into what became, I don't have any suffix for this or prefix, a family. I think in the very most real sense of it, except that we didn't live together the whole time, we were a unit. It was helped by the fact that Liz and I shared, if I may, our boys with our spouses. and a week at a time. And for all those years, we were working out how to live and how to get along. And I don't remember a moment of difficulty, of conflict, of disappointment or anger or afterthoughts or anything of the sort. And that was in large part due to the participation of Carolyn and Karl. And so some of the things about Karl that really struck me were the oppositions within him. He was a quiet man, as we say. I mean, it's almost the first thing you think of about Karl. And he was kind and gentle. Yet Karl was an organizer and a leader of a quite contentious fight by the union of faculty at UNH to become a bargaining unit, which requires recognition from the administration and acceptance, and requires a vote in which everybody campaigns, which can be a bitter process. And it all led under Karl's leadership as president for a time of the union, which was successful, to bargaining rights, so that they were established as a unit that officially bargained with the administration. And you can imagine that in that kind of setting, the administration is not very pleased with these developments and never take it easily. And it wasn't bitter or brutal at UNH. It was too polite for that, I think. But it certainly was not a peaceful, easy process. It was conflict. And Karl was a leader in that conflict. This quiet, soft-spoken, gentle man was also a leader in a time of conflict. His learning is, I'd be here much longer than either of us wants me to be here if I try to summarize it. And you've heard bits of it. The extraordinary breadth, and as John pointed out, the interweaving of the things that he learned in quite disparate disciplines, including classics, which was a start from which he moved a long way, was exceptional. He married linguistics with neurology and did the same kind of thing with his medical training and his biology training. And so that made him quite unusual in an area where people specialize and stick to themselves a lot. And he was able to do that. And he had places that he loved, and he kept adding to them. Here, Vermont, and then Hawaii, and then Greece. And there's too much more to go on. So I want to tell you just two things that really were the most extraordinary. The way he cared for Liz was not easy. It was not an easy job, and it was not a fast job. 6 years after she had her stroke, Liz was not capable of taking complete care of herself. She was not happy. Gradually, she lost all her exceptional range of physical abilities. She was a dancer, after all. And she was a good athlete, a very good athlete. And she was a good person, a fine person. And she lost that. She lost her ability to be patient, which was never her strongest suit. But it became really almost pathological how difficult she could be in some circumstances with entire justification. It was a struggle for her. And at no time did I ever see Karl express by even a look any sort of resentment or anything other than acceptance. It is one of the most extraordinary feats of human behavior and action that I have ever seen, or read about, or heard about. The only word that I could think of, and it's foreign to my religion, was saintly. Karl behaved like a person who was, in a religious sense, above smallness, above resentment, and he never faltered, I believe, in that. The other exceptional thing about Karl, which says a great deal about him, is what he did after Liz died. He resumed his extraordinary life without the institutional surroundings that had been part of his life always, and which had confined him, but also given the shape to his life. And what would you do? What would a lesser person have done in the beginning? Take off. He took off, not leaving behind a mess, dealing with everything that needed to be done, with Liz's things and with the house that they co-owned with Adam and Kristen, and went to Greece. And what did he do in Greece? All the things he loved to do and more. He taught English to immigrants. He learned, he studied, as John mentioned also, or somebody did, Greek, Demotic Greek, spoken Greek. He danced, which I believe he had started with Liz, is that right? Yeah, Liz, the dancer, introduced him, me too, to dancing with her productions. And let me mention in passing only, that Liz, when she was relieved of the boys full-time and of me, half-time and me full-time, exhibited and expressed an extraordinary degree of creativity and in music and in art. And admittedly, we were all older and could take care of ourselves better by then, but she just blossomed in that way. And one of the things she did was to co-create a dance based on Shaker life that I said then and still believe was an exceptional production of artistic merit. And we all danced. I stiffly, and my excuse was it was about Shakers. Karl, I think maybe for one of the first times in his life, and the boys all in this performance in a parking lot in Durham. And Karl, I think that was maybe the beginning of the closer kind of relationship between us, because we were both being, let's say, dancers, actors, actually puppets of Liz. Puppets in the parking lot, it could have been called. And so in Greece, he took up dancing very seriously, joined a group which met on the island where Icarus fell into the ocean nearby. What's it called? Is it Icaria? Icaria. And he returned there each summer, and I think at other times, to dance in a group of people who came from all over Europe and some other places in the world. And they danced for hours and hours and hours late into the night, every night. And he learned and learned and learned. Even then, in his dancing, he learned. And
the young women nicknamed him Karl Sonova.
Yes, he was not without the finer things in life, like romance there. And that full life of learning and teaching and dancing was the truest focused expression of Karl's life. And the generosity of the teaching, and I know the friendship and everything in his relations with other people there could summarize him well. And what I want to say to you, the one word, and again, my boy's speaking to it, but as I discovered, as I read through that obituary, all things that I knew, had heard before, had talked with Karl about, had absorbed and knew about him, kind of disappeared into one thing. And I realized that Karl, the reason I say he was like no other person I've ever known, is that he was so much and so did so well at so many things and was such a good person in doing it all. Karl now, to me, has become an extraordinary person, and that's the word, extraordinary, that I want to leave you with. My feeling is that he was beyond measure, beyond the ordinary, in his way of living a full and complete and good life.
So to use Phil's coining, another very important family member, Phil and Carolyn's daughter, and Karl's and Liz's goddaughter, Sonia Ginsberg.
Oh, that's not all. We have others.
Well, I'm lucky that I got an official title as goddaughter, because otherwise it would have been very difficult to explain exactly how Karl and I are related and how our relationship meant so much to me. I have a lot of really wonderful memories with Karl, a lot as a young child. Too many to share, but I was in fact just reminded of one sitting here when Adam put those Coke bottle glasses on, which was that Karl wore those to a murder mystery dinner that a friend and I planned and threw for my parents and Liz and Karl, who had to get into character. They had assigned characters, and I mean, talk about being puppets of someone. They basically performed for my friend and I when we were probably 12 or something. So lots of fond memories, a lot of them playful like that. But after the Zoom call this spring, I wanted to put a few in a note to Karl, and a lot of them were things that had been sort of coming up for me in the last 10 or so years since I had graduated high school and left home and gone from city to city, none of them very close, all of them a plane ride away. So I thought I would just read that note that I sent to him to share some of my really nice memories with him. As people shared on the Zoom call, I noticed that the word patience kept coming up and remembered how patient you were with me when I was a child. I feel so lucky to have been able to spend so many joyful and playful moments with you and Liz at the house when I was younger. I remember dressing up with you and bossing you around, telling you what lines to say as we played pretend. Astonishingly, you not only tolerated my liberal imagination, but encouraged it, going along with my directions with great commitment and good cheer. I remember us playing dress up, and I also distinctly remember one of us or both of us standing on the coffee table in the living room as we recited lines as he was my prince and I was his princess. What a wonderful gift that you gave me to go along with these antics and provide a sort of only child with a companion in her fantasy land. For the last 10 years or so, having moved from New Hampshire to New Orleans to San Francisco, back to Boston, memories with you, especially from the house in Lee, come back to me at random, and I receive them like little presents from the past. I remember playing in the garden, picking berries, swimming in the pond, you teaching me how to play chess, making pasta, playing piano and dancing, watching Babe, and being rocked to sleep in the swinging beds. I remember being held on your shoulders as a little girl while you patiently showed me the banana plant in the greenhouse and the wooden Balinese couch sculpture with the big tongue. Somehow being eye level with it made it less scary. Running down the long boardwalk you built to the pond and spending time together on the dock on the water. I hope that these memories bring you even a fraction of the joy that they have brought to me. I'm so grateful to have had you as a role model and a playmate. How wonderful to experience both in one person in one lifetime.
So we'll take a quick stretch break in a moment, but first I'm going to share a poem from my cousin Lauren, my dad's nephew. He wrote this poem for my dad for the celebration of life. Their connection comes through better in the poem than I can easily summarize here. One thing my dad and Lauren shared is academia. And so, not surprisingly, Lauren's poem is packed with important references as well as with deep feeling. A little bit of explication in advance then. Echo Hollow is the name for the property where my grandfather built the cabin my dad and his sister grew up in. It is an acronym that stands for Eunice, my grandmother, Connie, my aunt, Karl, and Oliver, my grandfather, who was also a forester. My dad ran track in high school and ran recreationally much of his life. My dad liked to talk about Roger Bannister, who ran the first under 4-minute mile. Miekor and Münster in the poem are places in Switzerland where my grandparents' pacifist Mennonite ancestors come from. So here is the poem by Lauren. And it's called In Echo Hollow. For Karl Conrad Diller, and read at the celebration of his life on April 9th, 2022. It's in 3 parts, not super short. In Echo Hollow, wooded with saplings, Latin labeled, now grown, you stand behind him, the arborist's apprentice, hefting root balls into autumn's cooling ground, wedged open by Oliver's muddied blade, then caressing the dawn redwood, or was it the white oak, or the flowering dogwood, planted to mark a child's birthing, and destined to outpace you, though you didn't quite know it yet, despite the record you would set in that Worcester High mile. It made the front page, not the tree, but that mile. Trees can take a while, slow to gain yet dwarfing us, and later absorbing us in April's gentle soaking of trunk and root extending. But still, you made that front page, stretching chest forward across that stage. Did they sprint like that in Miekor? Bannister trained on sand, you told me once, as we ran after dark through Trenton's Cadwallader Park. But Diller's and Conrad's did Bannister one better, I'd wager, scaling Switzerland's peaks until conscious or need, I've never fully known, drove them to Ohio's western border and beyond to the prairie's edge, where, in an absence of native others, they traded shepherding for draft horses and bees and 4-part harmonies in praise of the grace that had seen them that far. David and John, sons born under Northwood stars, bear their names, ancestors who sang in French and German, committed to the believer's baptism, for which their own mothers and fathers had died at the hands of those who would brook no dissent in matters of creedal assent, and yet they dissented, honoring conscience, and after Munster's horrors, refusing to enlist in future wars. Such conscience requires metal, and Oliver, brilliant and gentle, possessed it like steel, a moral sense unbendable, risking status and position, and communist baiting derision to hearken to another way, beyond the madness of nuclear annihilation, to a universal reconciliation, transcending salvation. We at length spoke of Oliver when you came in recent years for long walks in Bexley. Your championship sprint and those Cadwallader runs had faded, and yet your stride remained firm and wide. We remembered your father, his commitment to science and principle, his Christianity, you said, a matter of the ethical. You, too, I silently reflected, had kept the ancestral focus on what mattered, on amnesty for conscience, imprisoned demanding, even as from the God of our forebears, your freedom declaring. That revelation worried your sister, though she did often struggle to discern the divine. Did you ever speak of it together? Did you speak of it in time when she could still remember you, her dear only brother? She spoke of it to me, and on the precipice of my Jerusalem journey, you and I talked of it too, over that dinner I had with you. Harvested from your New England garden, you pointed to the horrors of biblical Joshua, I, heart-pounding, countering with the abominations of secular Stalin. It took me years to understand how the ancestral gods demand faith, not to dictum, but to conscience and to criticism. In these moments of remembering, on the precipice of our parting, I offer in humility my respect for your decisions, for your courage, your convictions. I have admired you always, dear uncle, winner of that mile, brilliant scholar, true conscience, gentle smile. In these last moments, I wish you comfort and fortitude and give you my gratitude. What else can I give? I give you my love. As yet, we live. So, next we have the Bach double violin concerto in D minor, and while they set up, you might just stretch a little bit.
So we're going to be playing the Bach's violin concerto in D minor for two violins and pianos. And this piece is somewhat significant in our family, in part because Karl loved Bach, as many of you probably know, and also because in studying the violin in the Suzuki method, this Bach double concerto is kind of the basis for the entire method of instruction. And a lot of the themes in this piece, Suzuki took and kind of threaded throughout the first, several books of instruction. And this was also our mother Liz's favorite piece, and something we all played together. And so that's sort of why we're playing it. So we'll do our best.
And we rehearsed it a couple times before we played it. Tried to put it together. And these guys have been playing, but Bubs and I had to pull these things out of the mothballs. And see how it goes.
So next we'll hear from Ann Tavel, Liz's sister.
Oh, I am shorter than ever. Jeez, what happened? What happens to us? I'm Ann Tavel, Liz Ginsburg's older sister. Oh, thank you. That's much better. Okay. Wait a minute. I gotta get my stuff. Oh my. One moment. Okay. Okay. Well, it's nice to see everyone. I haven't seen some of you for so long. Eden, Ellie, Cece, and Caleb. Anyway, I loved Karl very, very deeply. To me, he was sort of Phil, you were talking about him being saintly, which I've often thought of too. He's saintly, but so I'm not going to copy you. I think it just occurred to me that he was really like a knight. A knight. You know, he was a gentle knight. He really was. So, in all the time that I've known him, I always felt he was my brother. He was a really loving, gentle brother. And my three brothers are very, I have to say they were not always gentle. They loved to tease me and Liz and Karl, and I loved them dearly. But Karl was very different. I always felt like I could just talk to him about anything. And he could talk to me about anything. And in Liz's last couple of months, he and I talked a great deal. I knew how hard it was for him and for her. So, to me, I think that he has a sort of quiet courage about him. So when I think of a knight, I think of, he wasn't like a knight with a big sword, although he probably could sword fight too. I'm sure he could. He was very fit. But he had this quiet courage about him. And he had this really loving kind of strength that you always kind of felt from him. And I thought that was I think it's very special. Not many people that I know have those qualities. So I will be forever grateful to Karl for the loving care he took of my sister in the 9 years after her very tragic stroke. And I say tragic because for Liz, she was sort of at the height of her talents and her creativity, and she'd become an artist. And, you know, in addition to the dancing and the creativity she showed in that way. And it was really sad. It was more than sad. It was kind of tragic for her that she couldn't do these things anymore. And a lot of people would have become, she was not easy, as those of you who were around knew, and she couldn't help it. She tried her best to recover as much as she could, and he was right there with her. They tried everything you can imagine. And he was just always there. 9 years he was there for her. And who would read to their spouse in the middle of the night, and not get any sleep? He would do that for her. And it wasn't so much that he was so a martyr. He did it out of this sort of inner strength and deep love and commitment to her and dedication. That's where it came from. It didn't come from, I'm going to be St. Karl now, It came out of this deep, deep love and caring. And the two of them, what they created together in that house that they built is just incredible. I don't have words for it. It was just amazing. And the way that you boys helped them. And somebody John, you wrote in the obituary something that really struck me today when I was rereading it on the way up here. And you said, he let younger people help him. He let children help him, but it was more like an accompaniment, not an accomplishment. So that he valued their input. He valued what they were doing without being critical of them. And what an amazing talent, what an amazing gift that was. So I really think that his spirit, I can feel it, his spirit is going to live on in all of people that he touched who were affected by him. And what a gift he's given all of us. So that's what I have to say about me. And this is a poem that my brothers, Dave Holsinger and Marianne Holsinger, his wife, they wrote this. They visited us at our farm in Maine this July, and they couldn't come to this. They're back in Missouri. So this is the poem that they wrote. Memories of Karl Diller by Marianne and Dave Holsinger. Karl Diller, he was quite the guy. We welcomed him to the family, that's no lie. Husband to Liz and dancer extraordinaire. Many a time we enjoyed his special flair. A builder who could build a house with swinging beds that squeaked like a mouse. A cook who worked side by side with Liz, muesli for breakfast, dinner in a whiz. A gardener who could grow veggies and fruit, raspberries and blueberries and green beans to boot. An outstanding scholar who studied all the time, linguistics, genetics, music, and maybe a rhyme. His passions took him to places near and far, traveling to Japan, Hawaii, and Greece like following a star. A star he was, Robert Redford's good looks, thick white hair, a sly smile, a reader of books. His postcards in later life, much joy did they give. His legacy and life in our hearts forever will live. That's from Dave and Marianne.
Let me just say a little something about Jill. Not much, but just one of the things that my dad did after Liz died and he set off on his adventure to Greece is he started these email postcards. It would be a picture in the email and then some text about his life or his experiences, his thoughts, art that he went and saw. And there was a community of about 40 or 50 people who would send them to. And when he was in the hospital in November, I said, well, we should reach out to these people. And he wasn't up to it. And I said, well, can I? And so I did. And one of the great things that came out of that was correspondence with all these people across his life, across the globe, who he was in touch with, and some of whom I'd had interactions with over the years, and certainly people who were connected and in the orbits of our lives. And Jill is one of the important people in there with ongoing conversations with both his professional life and also the friendship between them. She can speak more to that. But so Jill Sinclair.
Hi. So I don't have to touch this, or you can hear me. And okay. Well, I wasn't planning to speak, but John asked me, so thank you, John, for inviting me to speak. It's hard to know where to start because there are so many highlights in my relationship with Karl over 36 years, which encompass being his student and on his teaching staff, as well as his mentoring me and becoming my friend. Not only did I continue to stay in touch with Karl long after he was my linguistics professor at the University of New Hampshire, but since he died, I am actively missing him, hearing and reading things I really want to tell him about that I know he would appreciate. Something I heard on the radio, a book I'm reading about language and the deaf culture. When my husband Bob said, it's interesting that so many societies are patriarchal, but it's called the mother tongue, I wanted to share that with Karl too. I hate not being able to just write to him and have him respond. And he never just wrote back. His responses were always deeply thoughtful. In 1986, Karl offered me a position teaching adult students from French Canada and Japan in his intensive English summer program at UNH. That summer position led to 8 more with him at the helm. The programs were a whirlwind. They began with much planning, and Karl and Liz hosted welcome cookouts for students and staff in their expansive Lee backyard with folk dancing inside. Their wide-open living space never felt crowded, no matter how many students, teachers, and friends were celebrating together there. I smiled when I looked back at the schedule for one of the welcome cookouts, where, among other duties, Karl was on songs and lobster dinner, along with Liz. I loved that music was such an integral part of our programs and my classes. Karl gave his teachers enormous freedom within a superbly crafted framework. In one memo, he told us, "Feel free to substitute activities of your choice. If you do so, please remember to indicate any changes on the master's schedule." The reason things went so smoothly is that Karl thought of every detail and made sure we were all informed and working in concert. Teaching is not a 9-to-5 job. It's who you are, and you think about it before, during, and after classes. The intensive English program at UNH was, as its name implies, even more of a commitment. In addition to teaching, we planned and led field trips and social events. It was demanding and consuming, but I got so much back that as I was getting tired, I was also getting recharged. Karl, with Liz by his side, supporting and complimenting him, and with her own fire, purpose, and inimitable style, designed a well-respected program which educated the teachers, too. He expected his staff to eat lunch together daily, which was a great pleasure, and for us to write and share detailed evaluations at the end of each program. In addition to reflecting on our own practice, we broadened our perspectives and learned from each other. In one evaluation I wrote, "I felt mentally barefoot, very free to do what I wanted, but at the same time having firm, guiding ideas." My favorite class to teach was theater games. Our Bible was Maley and Duff's Drama Techniques in Language Learning. Here, the authors express Karl's philosophy of language learning. Drama can help us to reverse the learning process, that is, by beginning with meaning and moving to language from there. Here's some of my writing from the summer of 1987 to give you a sense of how breathlessly paced and deeply meaningful these experiences were to me. July 6th, week 1, day 1, testing, singing, grading. Everyone was full of energy and it was channeled constantly and with gusto. I'm exhausted beyond zebra, but exhilarated. I got an office. The French-Canadian students buzzed and hummed. I tried to keep the tempo up, and suddenly I felt a fusion of confidence and competence. It was like during folk dancing at Liz and Karl's when I felt for a brief moment that both feet were off the floor and I was flying. July 9th, Karl gave a spiel about his toilet. I don't remember what was so tricky about his toilet, but I'm sure some of you do, and it was spiel-worthy. July 12th, must ask Karl for advice. He's good at logistics. Field trip to the cow barns at UNH. Standing by hay bales, I taught my students the idiom, "It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack." Bernard summed up the essence of experiential learning when he exclaimed happily, "Now we have the smell, the word, and the sound." They were very pungent that day. It's nearly 1 a.m. and I'm about to pass out. First full week. This is all I ever remember doing, and it stretches ahead for as far as I can see. I love it. My head hurts, and I am happy. Fast forward to 2008. I'd been a certified English for speakers of other languages teacher for years, and was at that time working with elementary students. I asked Karl for advice about some complex situations, and can't tell you how proud I was when he wrote back, "Your neuro-linguistic questions are good." Just the word neuro-linguistic, it's big. And I think you have good instincts about what is going on. He continued, "When you say that kids whose parents have limited English would be better off with a rich, relaxed first language input, one of the keys is rich. A classmate of mine at Harvard in the 60s did a dissertation on home environment influencing verbal aptitude scores, and found that children of policemen, for example, in authoritarian households where kids had to keep quiet and accept the word of the policeman father, had lower scores than those from households where parents encouraged bargaining, reasoning, and democratic planning." In 2009, Karl wrote, "Did you see the curious case of Benjamin Button? It may sound gimmicky, Brad Pitt being born with cataracts, wrinkles, arthritis, getting younger as he grows older, but it really is an excellent movie. It gets one thinking in fresh ways about aging, about the life cycle, about missed opportunities, and the unexpected directions a life can take. And as my career reverts from professor to student, going back to school with people in their 20s and 30s and collaborating with my professors in their 50s, Benjamin Buttons speaks to my condition, as they say. And I'm not sure if this was in one of his postcards or just in a letter to me, so some of you may have heard this. But it's the connection with Odysseus. Here I am steering between youth and old age, going down our one-lane dirt road, a ditch on the uphill side where you could only get stuck temporarily, and a cliff on the downhill side where you could tumble down into oblivion. When we met a pickup truck on this road, we crept by each other very carefully. Luckily, we were on the uphill side. Odysseus also chose to steer near the rocky cliffs of Scylla and lose only a couple of men, rather than risk losing his whole ship in the swirling whirlpool of Charybdis. Like Odysseus, I'd rather risk a rocky future than swirl down the whirlpool of oblivion. That epitomizes his spirit and captures how he thought and wrote about life. This past October, I shared some first grade anecdotes from my substitute teaching, and Karl answered, "What I remember from first grade was the day we got our first reading books. The book was Dick. See Dick. See Dick run. Run, Dick, run." I could read it, and boy was I angry. I went home for lunch, no school lunches in those days, and complained to my mom. Nobody told me I could read. Of course, then I could read anything I wrote, but I didn't know that I could read anything anyone else wrote or something from a book. Personally, I never think about resting in peace because though I'm uncertain about what happens after life, I do believe our energy continues on in some form. I hope it does so more than just organically, at some level of consciousness too. Karl would want to keep learning and growing and being curious and making connections across disciplines, wherever he is. So when I think about him now, I say, journey on in goodness, light, and love with Liz, Karl. Journey on.
So, as with Jill, there are a number of other people who we connected with, and one of those people will hear her notes in a second too, and Melissa will read those. But I wanted to just speak briefly to Melissa's role. She's really did so much correspondence and sharing of my dad's journey toward death, and it's just been really hugely, amazingly helpful how much she's done for this service, for the celebration of life, and for my dad. And I just want to acknowledge the importance of all of that background care and the environment and love that she's helped produce, modestly and in many ways unsung in the background, but very much central to me and to my dad's experience these last 2 years. So she'll be reading stuff from Ann Suda, a longtime friend and student of my dad who lives in Japan.
Oh, whose glasses are these?
Oh, yeah.
They're yours? Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Oh, thank you, sweetie. I do want to say, it was a gift to have Karl. You know, we got him in the last year and a half of his life. We didn't know it would be the last year and a half. We didn't actually know we were inviting him to live with us forever. We thought, it was the pandemic and it was a time of transition in his life, and we'd come and stay and, we'll see what evolves. And then he brought all this stuff and he was unpacking, and I looked at John and I was like, I think he lives here now. And it was really, I feel so lucky. I did not have a lot of opportunity. John and I have been together over 20 years, but most of you know I have a lot of health issues. I've neuropathic pain. It's very hard for me to travel. Karl was often kind of a little bit out of the way. And so I didn't get to spend that much time with him. So this was such a gift. We had a year and a half. And I really got to know him in ways that all of you are describing, and that was really a gift. This is from Ann Suda. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Yeah. Oh yeah, thank you. Oh great, thanks. My husband and I were both university teachers for many years, now retired. I probably got my job thanks to Karl accepting me into his course at UNH while we were there in 1983. Because Karl accepted me into the grad school, I was able to earn a degree, which enabled me to get a good job in a college here in Japan. Karl has meant a lot to me through the years since I met him when I was a grad student at UNH. I have many pictures of the parties we had each time I returned to New Hampshire. I really loved the house that Karl and his family built, which was started just at the time we were leaving UNH. I often stayed with them in Durham when I visited in the summer. I'm embarrassed to remember how often I imposed on them. I slept in one of those beds attached to the ceiling, a challenge to get into as I recall. Karl would take me to one of the summer craft fairs, and one time he and Liz bought some lovely pottery plates there. We used them for the lobster dinner that Liz fixed that evening, and my daughter and Liz danced around that large living room. So many memories. My husband and I got to know Liz and Karl even more when they were here in Kobe, teaching at Shoen University. Karl and Liz were so much in love, holding hands as they walked, which nobody does in Japan, snuggling together on the sofa. Karl even stayed here in our small Japanese apartment one time when he was guest speaker at a language event here in Kobe. He had to bend his head to get in the door. In recent years, I've been one of the lucky recipients of Karl's marvelous email postcards. I always have had a longing to visit Greece, and now I feel I've been there thanks to Karl. How inspiring to hear of his climbing the hills around Athens, dancing with a youthful group, and his wonderful concerts. I was also interested to hear of his living in a student dorm and teaching immigrants. I was beginning to think that Karl was like one of the Greek gods, going on forever. I will miss him, and my life is better because of him. I wish I'd had a chance to find out more about his research into the connection of language and the brain. There are so many topics I wish we'd been able to discuss like that. I've been looking at old pictures of our times in New Hampshire, what fun and how young we all looked. I have lots of photos of the parties that occurred with each trip I made back to Durham. Those pictures remind me of all the people who were connected with Kobe University or Shoen and showed up at our reunions. I think of Karl often, and I am so grateful for his friendship.
Next, we'll hear some music played by Cece Ginsberg, Matt's daughter and Karl's granddaughter.
I'm gonna play a piece called Angel Voices. It's fairly simple, but it's pretty.
And now we'll hear from Dave and my mom, Ann Diller.
Like the other Ann, I'm shrinking.
Yeah.
Is that good? Okay, thanks, John. I gave, as some of you know, I was a philosophy professor, and I gave a somewhat philosophical talk for the celebration of life, but don't worry, I'm not going to do it again. And if you want it, it's probably on that recording that they have. So all I want to do today is say just a couple of things. And I want to start with the music because we've had such wonderful music and it's been going on for these generations. So I want to tell a couple of anecdotes about the early years and music. When Karl and I realized we were pregnant with the person that would become John, and there was these 9 months for him to get through, and he didn't, and we were both graduate students, so we had more than enough to do. But he didn't quite know what to do while I was being pregnant. He decided to build a harpsichord because he already loved Bach, and of course Bach originally wrote music for the harpsichord. So as I was going month by month through the pregnancy, he was going month by month building a harpsichord. But the advantage of pregnancy is it does end whether you want it to or not because the baby just decides when to come out. But a harpsichord does not build itself at the end. So John was born, but the harpsichord was left unfinished. And of course, with a new baby and 2 parents who didn't know what they were doing, the harpsichord didn't get done quite so fast. But this is the next music anecdote. When John would cry, we would experiment with which music would calm him down. And as I recall, and I'm not sure about this, there was sort of a competition between Beethoven and Bach. And I think, but I'm not sure, that Bach won. Because what we would do would be, he would be crying, and then we would play one composer and see what happened. And then if he didn't stop crying, we'd play a different composer, and we would also see what happened. So that was very much already, the music was already in the space. And there's only one other thing I want to say, and that's about Karl's commitment to being a good parent. He and I were both totally, we didn't have children until we'd both been through graduate school, traveled in Europe, did all these things that you can do when you're still without responsibilities. So by the time we were ready to have John, we were really gung-ho into parenting. So no matter what else happened with us over the years, and I have to say, we were not a model like Phil. No matter what else happened, we were both so committed to wanting to do good parenting. And I just want to say, the evidence is here in front of you. Every single son and grandchild in this space is an amazing person. And we've just seen them and heard them. And this is something that mattered to Karl and me both. And I know wherever his soul may be, that this is something that he would be very, very proud of. So thank you to all the generations that are here. And I think that it's very, very important.
And now some remarks from my brother Dave.
So here we are. I should take Phil's, what did you say? I'm not accustomed to speaking in public. And I'm also not the scholar in the conventional sense that my mother and father have been. So I think I looked up on Google, what do you say, for memorial service? He said one of the things, there was many things. One of the things, choose a theme, So here's my theme: the acceptance of me taking my own path that I felt from my dad. And so in this way, not taking the conventional path of following his life and being accepted is really a real gift that I received from him. And there's a lot of notes here, and you can see that you probably wouldn't be able to read them, and I'm not sure that I can either. But I did have the chance to read his main book that he wrote before I was born, called The Language Teaching Controversy, and I sort of had this idea that maybe I'd take a little bit from that and try to bring it into this. And there was a section on the rationalist approach to language and language learning, and there was a part that was he wrote about saying this was a principle. One of the principles is the living language is characterized by a rule-governed creativity, and I think maybe there's still some lessons in this for me to learn, which is maybe why I'm speaking of this here in front of you, and I hope that you can kind of follow what I'm saying. He says, if language use is basically innovative, it is innovative only within the bounds of grammaticality. Even though limitations of grammaticality rule out a large number of word combinations, in spite of this, the innovative power of language is theoretically infinite. And he quotes someone named George Miller, and who estimated that if we were to limit the grammatical sentences to 20 words, then there would be 10 to the 20 power grammatical 20-word sentences in English, or it would take 100 billion centuries that's 1,000 times the estimated age of the earth, to utter all the admissible 20-word sentences of English. So this is to say, he says, that an infinite number of sentences can be produced by what seems to be a rather small, finite number of grammatical rules. So the way that I'm tying this in is that for him, it's easy for all of us, for many of us, it's easy to see the limitations of being a human in this world as limitations. But for him, I think, and I haven't actually had a chance, to share this with him, and that's one of the sad things now, that these things are coming up. Maybe, but I can still have the conversation with you and with myself. For him, to learn and to understand the limitations of being human are actually the creativity. It is the aspect of life, and that we don't need to see our limitations as obstacles, but we can see them as the actual creative force that is given to us as human beings. And I see him living out his full creativity and living a full life as a way of accepting, and also at the same time accepting me and accepting others to live out our full lives as a real gift. So maybe you can draw those connections too, I hope so. Some things I remember about him: pulling a garden cart full of wood over a bump and taking a deep breath and puffing his cheeks and blowing it out. And I was the little one watching him and like learning how to breathe and move and pull the cart. And he was really fully into life, and whether it was in the garden or whether it was with students and family and friends, in the office or out dancing and singing. He sang choruses. And being his son, there is a little bit of, what comes up for me is, well, how do I live up to someone like Karl, And this is part of the message that I'm trying to give, is that even though he was so skilled and talented and lived this full life, he really gave me the gift of allowing me to walk my own path, and that was a real gift. His 80th birthday we spent in India. We traveled in cars and buses and trains and tuk-tuks, three-wheeled vehicles, and walked. And we definitely saw a lot. He was full of adventure, and it was a great time that we enjoyed as adults together traveling. And one of the things that I really appreciated about that was we did see some amazing sights, but I think both of us really just enjoyed walking the streets and seeing the average person's life. And he really took a lot of value in everybody, however we live, not just the great heroes and heroines of life, but everybody. He loved to be involved in the world. And I did have this memory of the poem "The Road Not Taken" by Robert Frost, which many of you might know. And I hadn't thought of it, but there's definitely a memory of him being excited by this poem, or having some sense of value. I remember being small, and there was some sense of value that he had for this poem. And maybe he even introduced it to me, I don't know, and maybe he already, in a way, knew that I was going to take the path less traveled or something. But anyway, this is the poem, "The Road Not Taken," and by Robert Frost. "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler. Long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth, then took the other, as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that passing there, had worn then really about the same, and both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference.
Next we'll hear from Eden Ginsberg, Adam and Kristen's daughter, and Karl's granddaughter.
Hi everybody, my name's Eden, and I am Papa Karl's granddaughter. I think it's kind of funny because growing up, he was always my grandpa, not my step-grandpa, and I used to brag to all of the kids in elementary school that I had 4 grandparents, not 2, and that I was spoiled twice as much. So I think it's kind of funny because everybody coming up has been trying to figure out what their relationship to Papa Karl is. And while I was studying in school, and Papa Carl wasn't doing so well, I was thinking about that a lot and like the impact that he's had on my life, which is a huge one, really. Like Papa Carl basically was my grandpa, but almost like just a person who raised me. Like living next door to us, we used to have breakfast in the morning with my parents. And then we'd go to the other house and have a second breakfast. Like religiously, every morning we would do this. And Papa Carl would flourish in these breakfasts. He would make muesli and we'd help and we'd make him coffee. And over the years we got more creative and started making waffles instead. And he had like a method to these waffles. He would like whip the egg whites extremely thick and then add them in this like the second part. And so these waffles were like the fluffiest things you've ever had in your life. But we just have like a million memories from living at 143 with Liz and Karl. And me especially, I think Papa Karl was really close to me. Playing piano all the time. I think he kind of raised that musical spirit in us. And also just the creative spirit in us. Like I thought it was kind of funny that Sunny Bean started talking about playing make-believe with Papa Karl, because I think he might have recycled that experience on me and Ellie. He was also my prince once upon a time, and I was his princess and he was Prince Charming. I remember playing this vividly in Hawaii, wearing no shirt and like just a grass skirt, walking down the aisle with like a bunch of flowers in my hair and like a veil, and like we got married. Like there was a full service, a full wedding ceremony in the front yard. So just lots of joy. I think Papa Karl is a lesson in many things. Kindness being probably the biggest one. Listening, in laughter, in so many other things. Patience. Whenever he opened his mouth, he always had something really important to say. I remember when he died, calling my dad and talking on the phone for a really long time about all the beautiful experiences that we'd had living next door. But also just that now he's gone, we all have to be a little more kind to make up for it. And I think that's what he would want, you know. I also struggled trying to figure out what to say, you know, when someone dies and you know it's going to happen. Like what you tell them, you know. And being so far away in Wales, like there was no way that I could go to him, which was hard, but also kind of helpful because I got to flex one of the things that he also taught me, which was to write. Papa Karl was a brilliant man with words, reading so many books. And I'd like to think that maybe he passed a little bit of that down. And I'm an amateur poet. I'm not Robert Frost. But I wrote him a poem. And it was just really for him, just about what I was thinking about and stuff. And it was true to me at the time. But John told me that he really enjoyed it, and that he read it a few times, which really meant a lot to me. So I thought I'd read it for you. I hope it's okay. Loss is a lesson no one wants to learn, but we all do. A lesson that surprises you each time you learn it, a lesson in love and how precious we are to each other. A lesson that makes you pause and admire the little footprints we leave on each other, those little steps that make us and move us forward. What do you do when you know it's coming in? A cloud that grows darker and fuller hanging low in the sky. How do you say goodbye? How do you say thank you? How do you explain that? And then it rains. And you storm. You drop down by the bucketful. You flood the world. The ground soaks you up. And you promise it not to linger too long there, but to get up and dance in the rain. To be the pitter-pattering little steps that move the living forward.
paper. I've had a lot of chance to spend time with words, the obituary, and these little introductions, so I'll just share a little bit now. A couple memories. I'm 4 or 5, and we're putting a floor in the attic. My dad starts all the nails for me, and I hammer them in the rest of the way, so proud that I know how to hammer. There are still dents in that floor from my hammer, but I didn't hear about it then. It was a full invitation to just participate, to do something that made me feel like I had capabilities, that made me feel a part of what was going on. When I was 5 or 6, I was helping my dad in the garden, and there was this crazy bulbous vegetable, this bulb above the ground with leaves coming out of it, just in amongst the tomatoes. I discovered this thing. My dad planted it, but I discovered this thing among the tomatoes. And he let me have that discovery. And he got out his Swiss Army knife and peeled it and sliced up kohlrabi, which was my favorite vegetable for quite some time because of that experience. When I think about what I carry forward from him, there is so much of that patience, that attention to pedagogy, that desire to just be a part of things. There was no sense of work as burden or of labor. It was all living. It was part of what you did. And it was a good time. And I think especially as a high school teacher, I just took that forward. And another teacher commented once, we did a 2-week intercession, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to do something called Where Things Come From, Where They Go? And we would go to places that made stuff, but also recycling centers and places that composted things. And another teacher joked that somehow I got 16 students to be very excited to go to the dump. And I think that is a part of my dad that I carried forward into that teaching. What it means to just have fun doing anything, whether it's theater or going to see something else that someone's going on and doing. There's a trope that's come up in my life with Melissa about having the right tool for a thing. It's amazing when you have a good tool, and I think my dad was very intellectual, and high culture was very important to him, but he was someone who would get in there and do the thing. He tells a story that the septic tank clogged up in our house. I was 3 at the time, and he had a friend, Fred Glock, was there, and they were like, well, we don't have any machinery to do this. So they thought, well, how would they do this in China? At the time, China was technologically focused more on people power than the current high state of technology. So they said, well, they would get buckets. So we will get buckets, and we will clean out the septic tank, and it will work again. He was willing to go get the buckets. Bucket is a pretty simple tool, but I think tools were so important for my dad. He always carried that Swiss Army knife. And once we got to the screening, he couldn't take it on airplanes, and he was traveling airplanes, and it's, you either have to pack it in your checking baggage or just leave it behind. But for all my child, he had a Swiss Army knife that he would pull out. When he built the house, he had these crazy hammers. They were ergonomic hammers. He and Liz, they were bent. So supposedly you had a better angle when you're hammering. I'm not sure that I ever learned to prefer them, but I love that he chose them and wanted them. And not only chose them, but long after he had been hammering much at all, he brought them to California in his cargo, along with the paintings by Liz and the pottery that he'd accumulated. So now Dave and I both have one of those ergonomic bent hammers that we might use in hammering things. Ideas were important tools for him too, of course, and that was a big part of his academics, but not just his academics. Christopher Alexander's A Pattern Language was a set of ideas that inspired the building of that great house and really informed it, but also informed his sense of how to be in the world. There are other books by Christopher Alexander about what community is. And those were important. This idea that ideas and the right tool were important. And after Liz died, he visited briefly on the way to Hawaii to spend a few months there. And we went to the Berkeley Art Museum, and they were doing a big display on, largely on the late 60s and early 70s. And one of the things that they were looking at was this catalog, the Whole Earth catalog, which was so important to him, this catalog of tools, of the right tools. And he felt so seen by this exhibit of this time that when he was coming of age, that he was in grad school and just reading the Whole Earth catalog and these tools. So I think how to find the right tool and to use it was something really important to him. But more than that, it was the people you'd use it with and the spirit you'd use it in. Those benefits of tools carried forward even to his adventures. He couldn't take his Swiss Army knife to Greece so much, but he could take his 35 pocketed travel vest with 3 pockets for different glasses and a special lanyard for the glasses cleaner and a pocket for his ID and a pocket for his credit cards and a pocket for his sandwich. And I mean, it was amazing what he didn't need a backpack. He just wore this travel vest full of things. Lauren now has one of those travel vests. It fits him well. They're the same size. I hope he is able to travel with it and enjoy it. I visited him in Greece, and there is a sense, his quiet contentment and ease means that my dad didn't have that many misadventures. I was thinking, what would be a good story? Well, a misadventure would make for a good story. He had lots of adventures, but not so many misadventures. And traveling in Greece was mostly like that for us, for those 2 weeks that we spent together. But it did remind me there was a misadventure, I think probably my favorite misadventure, that involves tools of ideas, but also sort of a passion of romance. He and Liz went to Hawaii, to the Big Island, for their honeymoon. I don't know when they exactly timed that, given all the things that were happening, but they went together and they went alone and they went to the North Shore off season and no one else was around, and they rented some sort of camper on a truck. I always picture one of those compact Datsun trucks with this little tiny camper on the back. I don't actually know exactly what it was, but something pretty modest and probably pretty beat up. And they drove, out into where there aren't barely anybody, and there was some town not too far away where they imagined they would get food and things like that. But they both almost immediately upon arriving got horribly sick with flus, and stomach flu, and they really couldn't go anywhere. And they didn't have very much food, and they didn't have the energy to drive places. But my dad knew plants, and the parking lot full of cracks around them was full of purslane. And so they lived on purslane soup for about 3 days until they felt better enough to go into town and get a proper meal. And that story was always told with some relish. I mean, imagine being sick and not feeling good enough and just eating these wild greens in a soup for all your meals. But that was a good experience. That was part of what he took there. And similarly, the closest to misadventure we had in Greece was we hiked this trail. We were walking 10 miles a day in Athens, but walking apparently down a few thousand feet gorge for 10 miles was a little challenging when you're 82. Or 81, anyway. So the special pickup donkey had just passed us, sort of the sweeper that catches the people who aren't going to make it to the ferry, when my dad said he needed to lie down because his back was seizing up. And there was still a chance we would make it. But he needed to lie down pretty consistently as we were going. He'd lie down, get up, walk, lie down, get up, walk. So at a certain point, I ran ahead to see what could be done. And he slowly made his way. And I found out the ferry had left, but there was a water taxi. Someone had a speedboat potentially. But my dad was still up the trail quite some time, and in order to meet the bus that the ferry was meeting, we would still need to catch this water taxi pretty quickly. I did manage to get the loan of a car, this dusty old Honda Accord, and drove it up the road. And I pulled up next to my dad, and he didn't, of course, imagine anyone was coming for him in the car. But I said, "Do you want to ride?" And he looked at his big smile. And I remember the thing almost most vivid about that misadventure is he sat down in this dusty car chair, the just pleasure, sitting down and safe and not walking anymore. Not the angst of having all of this crazy, but the pleasure of sitting in this dusty chair and knowing that we're going to drive back and then get in this speedboat. And we made our bus and made it back to our hotel. Didn't have to stay in this town that had no roads. So I think I had more adventures than misadventures with my dad. The tools were important. And the things that I'll carry forward most are all these subtle things that I might not have marked. Just the way that I'm in the world, the way I interact with people, the way I enjoy whatever activity happens to be on order, the way I look for connection and inclusion and accompaniment. Those are the ways in which I carry him forward. And I have to say, I didn't know sort of what missing a parent when they're gone would be. Sometimes it's sort of ordinary. Sometimes I want to tell them something. And then other times I just get blindsided by grief. I imagine that's how it will continue for quite some time. But I hope to, like him, have that be part of my enjoyment of life. I'd like to provide an open invitation if there are people who haven't shared, you want to share a little something, you're welcome to. And then after that, where we have a dear family friend, Catherine Sullivan, has got a tree to plant as part of the legacy of not only what they do here at the Browne Center with honorary plantings, but also, of course, my grandfather planting so many trees in honor of people in their births, their weddings, their deaths. And so we have a dawn redwood to plant, and my brother will speak more about that later. But so after, there'll be an opportunity for anyone who hasn't spoken to speak. And then there's a path at the end of the parking lot that leads a little ways down. It's not a far walk at all. And we'll plant the tree in a hole that Dave and I have already dug. And then we will have, then there will be food available too after that. So if anyone would like to, please, yes.
It's short as fine.
This will be very brief. I know Karl through Jill, obviously, all these years, and I've listened to everything. And you can tell from this that I've met a lot of people in my life over a great period of time. And from what I hear, Karl was Karl was the most non-judgmental human being all of us will probably ever meet. That's all I have to say.
I'm going to tell you a Karl and Liz story from Dame Road, which is the road we're on. Okay? There's a beautiful farm down the road called Dame Farm. And when I was a student here 40 years ago, all of us who took dance class from Liz lived at Dame Farm. And so there was we had parties there, and dance parties, of course, and they had invited Liz. And I had not seen Karl yet, but it was pouring down rain. And there, of course, was a mud driveway, total mud. And here comes Liz to the farm, and she has this man on her arm. And he is glowing. I had seen Karl glow throughout life, but that was the first time. And his face, he was so in love. He was so happy. And they came graciously to this party given by students in a rundown old farm so that we could dance in the rain. And it's one of my most precious memories of both of them.
I would just like to emphasize something which has been touched on, Karl's dancing. And I think that is what brought he and Liz together. And I was a friend. Actually, I came out to New Hampshire to work for Phil Ginsberg. So I met Liz and Phil and the boys were about this high at that time. And I was also a dancer. I am a dancer. And I can't tell you how much I miss not being able to dance because of COVID. Renaissance, Scottish, and English dancing. But for me, dancing is a metaphor. It's a way of life. It's a way of going through life. And when I think of Karl, whom I then met later, I think of his dancing and what that meant to him. I didn't get to know Karl very well except at the Thanksgiving celebrations, which I was so generously invited to. But the very last time that I talked with Karl was almost exactly a year ago in the Screen House at Phil and Carolyn's, and it was Carolyn's birthday. And we were standing around in a circle, and I was next to Karl. And I want to say that Karl and I were born in the same year. I don't think the same month, but the same year. And Karl and we were celebrating Carolyn's birthday, and Karl and Maddie were fooling around like they often did. And suddenly there was blood on Karl's hand. So I just grabbed some napkins and bandaged it up a little bit. And he said that he was going back to Greece because he'd paid for this dancing program on an island and not gotten to go, so he was going to go. But I looked at him and he was quite pale. And like me, his skin was dry and very sensitive, and so he bled. And I thought, you can't go to Greece. You can't do that. But he did, of course. And I can't tell you what an impression and inspiration that has made on me.
I didn't mean to do this. My name is Deanna Wood. I was one of Karl's colleagues in the formation of the faculty union at UNH during those very passionate times. And of all the things that people have said about Karl, and they're all true, and I think Karl was one of the first things I recognized about Karl was that he never aged. Every time I saw him for a period of 10, 15, 20 years, he looked exactly the same. John, I thought he was immortal. I really did, because this man he just took whatever he had with him. But one thing that hasn't been touched on, except maybe obliquely through his ethical leanings, was a very fierce sense of justice and fairness. And it ran as an undercurrent. It wasn't always obvious, but you knew whenever he spoke that it was there. And that dishonesty and bullying and just being unfair in the way that third graders think about unfairness on the playground. He detested it. He had this sense that he was going to work to make this work, and he was going to work to make it fair for everyone. And the group of us, the small group of us that put that union together, looked to him for that sense of honorable justice. And I just wanted to share that with you.
Well, thank you so much. It's been really something to share this. I thought maybe we should sing "'Tis a Gift to Be Simple" as we did at the Celebration of Life, but maybe we could sing it on the path down to the tree, since the hour is getting late. Dave, do you want to say stuff here, or do you want to say it by the tree?
Yeah, maybe I'll say something here.
Okay.
So thanks to Google, I have a little bit of information here to share. I'll say a little bit more than what's on Google, maybe. So our grandfather, Oliver Diller, was a forester in Ohio, and on Google, I looked up in 1948. They were around 1948, before or after that, they discovered a living fossil, the Don redwood or metasequoia. There's another. I don't know if I have the third Latin name here. Glyptostroboides in China. So they had believed that this tree had become extinct, and then they discovered in China this living fossil, and my understanding is that the tree now was in a morphological stasis for the past 65 million years, which means basically that the current variety of metasequoia that we're going to be planting appears to be identical to its late Cretaceous ancestors. And so I don't really know for sure, but I can imagine a forester in Ohio, Oliver Diller, finding out about this, and it was said that this was one of the greatest discoveries of botany in the 20th century, to find this. So I just imagine Oliver Diller finding out about this Don redwood, the metasequoia. And from my understanding of our cousins, grandparents, that Oliver Diller actually played a part in helping bring the sequoia to North America, actually bring it back, because there are fossils of the same tree in the Northern Hemisphere, in Canada and elsewhere in the world, of this tree. So it's sort of reintroducing it to North America in this modern era. Was taken partly by our grandfather, and that in 1948 Karl would have been about 9, I guess. So he also probably knew something about it, and they took a trip where Karl was the chauffeur for the family out west. And I remember Dad telling stories about seeing the redwoods out west, which are a different species, but just that trip and how special it was to see the redwoods in the west, for him to drive the family out there. So there's a little bit of information about the metasequoia that we'll be planting here in honor of him. We can bring our own meaning to this planting of the tree here. If you feel up to it, you can join us. You can also hang out in the air conditioning if you want to rest, and we'll have some food as well soon. So.
so many crickets.
There's a shovel behind you.
That one's Carl's shovel there too.
Is it?
You put a shovel for me? Sure.
Just either one is fine, yeah. We're kind of alternating.
I swat. I shoot it off and so with a name like Eden, isn't it?
Anybody else?
Incumbent on you to do this?
I guess so. Gotta keep the garden going, you know?
Yeah.
For sure.
The back is going to need some of that.
Yep.
Kayaks and canoes out there.
Oh, yeah.
You go out and around the
You do another? Two at a time.
You're used to doing this, right? Woohoo, look at that. Look all done. No. Where do you want to be? Here?
Behind you.
Behind you. Yeah.
Take a scoop of that and put it around the tree. Just put it around the tree.
Probably bank it around the back side. Come back later with water, it'll hold it. I thought I saw it.
Well done. Yeah.
Can we go back up?
We'll beat everybody.
So while we put the water on, let's sing the one verse of "'Tis a Gift to Be Simple." If you don't know, just fake it. Dave, can you start us with a note? 'Tis the gift
To be simple, 'tis a gift to be free, 'tis a gift to come down where we want to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, we'll be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend we shan't be ashamed. To turn, there'll be our delight, till turning around.